So, I've been listening to Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind on Audible, but it was infuriating. So, I got it on Kindle to annoy myself even more. But more so I could dissect it as I went through it. It's a postmodern approach to history, using deconstruction to explain historical hierarchies and events through the prism of collective fictions. In some places, it's correct, but in others, it's woefully wrong because he's viewing historical events through his imagined reality of social, sexual, and racial equality, basically liberalism. So I could group large sections together and dissect them, but the way this book is sequenced, it flows from one topic to the next, strategically omitting points, never saying everything he has to say about the subject, but using deliberate and specific angles and language to convey a message, to push his narrative. So I'm going to go through parts in order, picking interesting sections to give criticisms, thoughts, or questions, and examples of points where Yuvel is being particularly tricky and connecting things that really have no connection. But by virtue of the language he uses, an excellent writing style, and the ability to draw convoluted parallels, he does spin a compelling yarn, one that, to the uncritical eye or unaware of what is being done, escapes the reader's attention and allows them to be propagandized into a more liberal worldview. It's almost subliminal, kind of like neuro-linguistic programming at times, and it's fairly subversive, but then that's how postmodern literature works. Do excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, but let's continue on anyway. About the author, I encourage all of us, whatever our beliefs, to question the basic narratives of our world, to connect past developments with present concerns, and not to be afraid of controversial issues. Dr. Yuvel Noah Harari, blah blah blah, lectures at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I mean, it says it all really. In loving memory of my father, Shlomo Harari. So, when I first listened to Sapiens, I never caught this intro, but reading this, the narrative in the book makes a lot more sense. He asks the reader to prepare to question the narratives of our world. This is directed at traditional people, natural people. It does not mean liberal readers. The story he pushes is entirely in keeping with their narrative. But the beginning of the book, it's a kind of a primer that gets the reader thinking about this book as impartial. Harari starts with an unbiased, scientifically cogent depiction of prehistory, a believable narrative lending a sense of credibility to him, inspiring goodwill in the reader to give him the benefit of the doubt. Apart from this first unsettling Semitic trope, it is unsettling and perhaps thrilling to think that we sapiens could at one time have sex with an animal from a different species and produce children together. Thrilling, is it, Noah? Degenerate. But I digress. They maintain that the people who drove the Neanderthals to extinction, settled Australia, and carved the Stadale Lion Man were as intelligent, creative, and sensitive as we are. Okay. Aborigines are as intelligent as Europeans, drinking petrol and sleeping on main roads. Okay. Just an example of his universalist liberal dogma. Aborigines are the same as Europeans. So here in the Legend of Pujo, he initially talks about chimps and then moves on to humans, and this is where we get into some of the good stuff. So similar patterns probably dominated the social lives of early humans, including archaic Homo sapiens. Humans, like chimps, have social instincts that enable our ancestors to form friendships and hierarchies and to hunt or fight together. However, like the social instincts of chimps, those of humans were adapted only for small, intimate groups. When a group grew too large, its social order destabilized and the band split. Even if a particularly fertile valley could feed 500 archaic sapiens, there was no way that so many strangers could live together. In this passage, he acknowledges for early humans, bands of strangers could not live together. Notice he distinguishes between sapiens then and now by saying early humans and archaic sapiens, to imply our instinctual nature is different now to fit his liberal globalist worldview. Remember, he's already implied Aborigines, an archaic people who've lived in primitive isolation for between 40 and 100,000 years, are the same as Europeans to fit his racial equality worldview. Can an archaic people like the Aborigines, be both the same as the Europeans in kindness, creativity, intelligence, and instincts, while simultaneously modern human instincts differ to that of archaic people. When you look at it holistically, it's a mess of conflicting ideas, intentionally never juxtaposed and spun strategically to bolster liberal mantras. How did Homo sapiens manage to cross this critical threshold, eventually found in cities comprising tens of thousands of inhabitants and empires ruling hundreds of millions? The secret was probably the appearance of fiction. Large numbers of strangers can cooperate successfully by believing in common myths. And here he disregards his earlier acknowledgement that bands of strangers cannot live together, and instead offers the solution that we can live together by sharing common myths. What he doesn't deal with is, what if the tribes that now live together have different myths, ones that they brought with them from far off lands, that they refuse to relinquish, or ones pushed into the popular culture by subversive outsiders, like say, whites are racist and should repent, and minorities are strong, brave, and should be elevated above the national stock, or they should rail against the evil oppressors. Should white folks accept these common myths, as we are replaced and set to become minorities in our own nations? Any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in the people's collective imagination. Churches are rooted in common religious myths. Earlier, Harari identified legends, myths, gods, and religions appeared with the cognitive revolution, and points to Sapiens' ability to imagine a lion's bird being the guardian of a tribe as the most unique feature of Sapiens' languages. And having identified that humans can share abstract ideas, proceeds to relate the deeply held but inconsequential myths of archaic tribes to Christianity and to the nation state. He has done this on numerous occasions already, and his contention is these myths are only present in people's collective imagination, and thus the myths of an archaic hunter-gatherer tribe are no different than that of the church and all of its canon, or the nation states and all of the history that comes with them. This is an attempt to imply the ramblings of a tribe shaman are equivalent to the transcendental nature of the church. Are these myths the same? Because the things that have arose from these myths are completely different. So Noah would have to either agree the myths are not equivalent, or retract his liberal talking point that Aborigines are the same as Europeans. It's standard moral relativism, and completely ignores the perceptible difference between the nodes he wishes to connect. A simplistic vision. It's a concise and neat narrative that develops the story he is telling, expertly written to obscure the plot holes. Two Serbs who have never met might risk their lives to save one another because both believe in the existence of the Serbian nation, the Serbian homeland, and the Serbian flag. And again, he drives home his fallacious idea that nations don't exist. The reality of nationhood and how that manifests itself in not only the mind of those who are part of it, but in customs, camaraderie, a sense of loyalty, pride, patriotism, and the sense that there is something above the individual is completely ignored. Are these feelings imagined? Because they seem very real to anyone who hasn't had their mind polluted. Yet none of these things exist outside the stories that people invent and tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. Having initiated his attempt to pry away people's beliefs from them by calling them common myths, he asks people to disregard the metaphysical nature of most everything that makes up society, and denying themselves the tangible reality that these things produce around them, attempting to pass them off as meaningless. Again, he preaches to us that our belief in nations and brotherhood mean nothing. These are primers that we should accept the dissolution of our states and surrender our rights to a nation of kin. People easily acknowledge that primitive tribes cement their social order by believing in ghosts and spirits, and gathering each full moon to dance together around the campfire. What we fail to appreciate is that our modern institutions function on exactly the same basis. Take for example the world of business corporations. Modern business people and lawyers are, in fact, powerful sorcerers. The principal difference between them and tribal shamans is that modern lawyers tell far stranger tales. The legend of Pucho affords us a good example. This is a false premise the uncritical reader has been edged into accepting. Modern institutions come in many forms, be they political, religious, family, artistic, social, and economic. It's interesting he picked business to continue his narrative, because political, religious, familial, artistic, and social institutions all have transcendent elements to them. Governmental or political service is a recognition of the nation state and a duty to serve and put above yourself the well-being of the stock of that nation. Religious institutions recognize a transcendental divine creator. Family and marriage represent the casting aside of a purely individual identity, creating the union of man and woman with the goal of reproducing in a stable environment in order to continue and replenish the stock of the nation, always looking forward to the future. Artistic institutions represent the pinnacle of human creativity and hierarchical nature of cultural aspirations. Social institutions represent the community, a collective, camaraderie, and something above the individual. As he attempts to deconstruct these institutions, he does not want the reader to have a notion of transcendence, that there is something above them, something greater, lofty things that surpass his individual needs and desires. This is counter to keeping him in a purely material-minded state, a good consumer. He wants to frame these institutions, reducing them in your mind to mere functions of capitalism. He does this in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. People generally have negative associations with lawyers and corporations, and by giving their origin story as a kind of sorcery or legal trickery, he inspires trust in the reader by validating their distrust of both lawyers and corporations. He also gets to push his narrative on, never having to deal with the pitfalls that come with questioning any of the other institutions, because the majority of readers know they serve a function greater than that of simple materialism, and still believe in one form or another these institutions and the transcendent nature of them. Individualism, materialism, and liberalism are the universal common myths Harari wants disparate tribes living together to believe in, a completely materialist bugman delusion. Each deliberate omission and fallacious equivalence he draws is directed at safeguarding his thesis against the natural aversion common people would have to it, whilst he incrementally makes bolder claims, justifying those claims with incomplete data by omitting counter-arguments and his own failure to view even the simplest things holistically. At the same time, he wants again to connect nodes that are unconnected. Earlier in the text, Noah equates the myths of the church to that of archaic tribes, shamans to lawyers, and then talking about modern institutions, he chooses a corporation. This is a trick to connect religious institutions to business. He does this to minimize the importance of the church, and it is deliberately to make the sacred profane, to take that which holds value, which means something, which has narrative, and equate it to a car manufacturer. If you had lived back then, you would probably have thought twice before you opened an enterprise of your own. And indeed, this legal situation discouraged entrepreneurship. People were afraid to start new businesses and take economic risks. It hardly seemed worth taking the chance that your family would end up utterly destitute. He gives the reason for corporations by telling a story about people becoming destitute and having to sell their children into slavery if their business failed. A seamless transition, implying he was only talking about the institutions like Peugeot to get to here, and not to equate the fundamental institutions on which societies and cultures are built on to companies. Previous mentions of the church prime the reader's mind for associative language, and a specific use of the words poor and destitute expose this. These words evoke images of Christ and the recollection of Scripture. Blessed is the one who is considered of the destitute, the Lord will deliver him when times are evil. But I am poor and destitute. Make haste unto me, O God, thou art my help and my deliverer. There is dozens upon dozens of examples in religious texts depicting God as the salvation of the poor and destitute. But Noah, not content with diminishing the church's role in our civilization, then equating the church to an auto manufacturer, he now wants to elevate corporations as the salvation of the poor and the destitute. A bizarre postmodern word game he has played, arbitrarily grouping things together to denote equivalence, then distinguishing them with subliminal loaded language. Harari's ideology is an ideology of liberalism, and his method by which he spreads it is subversion. Religion is meaningless, your nation is false, your culture is based on a lie. And now, having laid the foundations by comparing the founding of churches to archaic tribes, denied the perceptible realities of nations and nationality, equated modern institutions to just businesses, compared shamans to lawyers, diminished the historical importance of religious institutions, elevated businesses as the saviours of the destitute. Now he can explicitly say, Catholic priests are merely sorcerers. Now, you may not believe in God or the supernatural, but most believe in something greater than themselves. This is his attempt to remove all of those beliefs in something above the individual by equating all of the sources people find a greater belief in and dissecting some of them by telling a story whilst omitting the rest, hoping the reader will just accept his narrative, that they are all imaginary, that they are all meaningless. The reason I find this so insidious, so subversive is, imagine knowing there was something deeply wrong with the world and not understanding what it is, not understanding yourself or humanity, and since you know there is something missing, like any sane person, you search for answers. You come to Sapiens and you think, this will give me an insight into how and why we are the way we are. This homosexual Jew, then proceed to dissect everything you're supposed to be, everything that could make that person whole again, give them a sense of meaning, identity, purpose in life, is inverted, diminished, and transformed into something as inconsequential as a prosaic car manufacturer. And here we see why he's used the trickery. Telling effective stories is not easy. The difficulty lies not in telling the story, but in convincing everyone else to believe it. This is why the sleight of hand has been used. He knows telling an effective story isn't easy, and the narrative he wants to present is a difficult one to believe, and the outcome of the propaganda he wants to present would be unpalatable in any other format, so he uses trickery to spin a yarn, to connect unconnected things, the sacred and the profane, and equate them in such a way that it escapes the uncritical eye. Imagine he just came out and said, the church is no more important than a corporation. You'd say no. Even if you did not know the foundational importance to Western civilization this institution had, you would say no, not really. It has great history, significance in people's lives. It has been the reason for many great charitable deeds. It has inspired great buildings and fostered communities, nationhood and brotherhood, etc. The list goes on. Imagine he said your identity is meaningless, not important. The history of your people, your lineage, your future progeny, irrelevant and interchangeable. You'd burn his book. So he deconstructs Western civilization and follows a logical sequence, one designed to remove from your mind the importance of these institutions to our forefathers and for our civilization, because he knows as our real institutions lose power and importance in people's lives, our civilization and the things that hold it together falter and fail, and the story of our civilization has been vilified, revised and stolen. And since our story and narrative has been removed from us and supplanted by liberalism, he wants for us that we have no right to say, no, my people are important to me. I hold my people's well-being above all else. Fuck your human rights. Fuck your universalism. Fuck your liberalism. So even though he has already stated human rights are a figment of our imagination, he attempts to break down the structures that bind us because he doesn't want us to be able to say, if your human rights encroach on my people's ability to survive and prosper, your human rights should be cast aside, like the fiction that they are, and you should be dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. A simple example of how this way of thinking affects the politics of anyone polluted with it being in Ireland in just the last couple of weeks. Irish politicians want to bring in hate speech laws, pushing universalist liberal ideals. But the enactment of these laws will limit nationals' rights to object to our ethnic replacement. When these universalist liberal ideals are pushed, it is necessary to unfairly limit the rights or reject the wishes of the majority in favour of an illusionary equal outcome that will never be or is inherently unjust. For instance, diversity quotas inevitably lead to restrictions or rejection of brighter students or more qualified applicants. Another example in Ireland being the government wanting to do a commemoration of the RIC and the Black and Tans, to equally respect the dead of all traditions, a kick in the teeth to the Irish that died at the hands of these war criminals. Well, The folks of Ireland said fuck off. We haven't swallowed the pill you're selling. You may have forgotten our history, but we haven't. Noah wants you to question not the myths, but the realities on which our societies have been built. He tricks the reader into believing that he's an honest broker by appearing open and honest and giving a nuanced perspective. But the weight he gives to the narrative he spins far outweighs the points in which he alludes to an alternative perspective. He spins a yarn that necessitates you believe certain untruths, then quietly concedes the untruths or alludes to them being there. He spends the entire book deconstructing the foundations of Western civilization, its institutions, and the identity of its peoples as imagined realities, explaining them as social constructs removed from who we are as people, removed from your biology or anything transcendental. To the reader, the effect is a cogent liberal narrative painting a picture, whilst its quiet concessions give the impression of impartiality. To the uncritical eye, or ignorant of what is being done, or the arguments against this position, they take home the compelling liberal arguments and forget the quiet concessions or obvious fallacies, as is natural when one doesn't have total recall. This book is far too big to do in one sitting, but it's full of stuff like this. Quite insidious, quite covert, quite underhanded, postmodern manipulation and omission of facts, and failure to see things in a holistic way. I'm going to do another video on this because there's much more obvious examples of what it is that he's doing, and they will become more apparent as I do another video or two. And yeah, it's important that you understand exactly what's being done, and there's lots of it in here, so I'm going to leave it at that, and thanks for listening. Goodbye for now.